All right, so I've been given the thumbs up. So I'd like to welcome everybody here today to the Stone annual public lecture. Let me start by thanking the Stone Foundation for funding both the lecture as well as all the events that and activities we conduct in the Stone Center at UCL. The Stone Center at UCL has a unique mission to try to understand the causes and consequences of wealth inequality and economic inequality interpreted more broadly. And what makes us slightly distinct from many other Stone Centers is the close integration of education on these topics with research into these topics. Today's lecture is the third annual lecture that we're hosting. The first one was given by Philippe Aghion, looking at the relationship between innovation, growth, and inequality. The second lecture was given by Gabriel Zuckman, looking at wealth taxation. And we're delighted to have the third lecturer in our annual series to be Susan Dynarski, who's going to be talking about another very central issue in the work of the Stone Center, which is more focused on horizontal inequalities and understanding the role of the post-compulsory education system in both determining human capital accumulation, its impacts on inequality, and as a potential driver of social mobility. So let me try to get this right. So Sue is the Patricia Alberg Graham Professor of Education at Harvard University, and she's previously held professorships at the University of Michigan. I think it's fair to say that Sue is well recognized as a global leading expert on the economics of education, and she's made seminal contributions to understanding differences in access to higher education, as well as differential impacts on those who go on to higher education. And Sue's done a tremendous amount of influential work to try to understand what policies might be effective in closing some of these gaps in access and benefiting from higher education. So I think Sue's going to touch upon some of those issues later today. We're all very much looking forward to hearing her insights, drawing on work from both the US and linking it to things that are really at the top of the policy agenda in the UK. So just to let everybody know the format for today, Sue's going to speak for about 40 minutes. And then we're very fortunate to have Gavin Kelly, the new Chief Executive of the Nuffield Foundation, who'll be giving an instant discussion and linking some of the discussion to issues in the UK. And then we'll be handing over to Bethan Stanton from the FT to lead on a Q&A session where hopefully there'll be a lot of discussion where everybody can participate. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Sue. And Sue, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us today.
So I'm going to be talking about touching on some facts and some opinions on post-secondary policy, largely in the US, but there are definitely parallels with what's going on in the UK. I'm going to count on my co-panelists to draw those more cleanly, but I think you'll see some of them yourself. So how is inequality linked to education? Just to make clear, education is a key predictor of well-being, right? So earnings in particular, most prominently, earnings are higher for those with more education, particularly those with a university education, compared to those who don't have, who stop at secondary school. But beyond earnings, also it's a predictor of health and of wealth and political participation and civic engagement and happiness and just about anything you can think of. We can see a correlation with education. And some more advanced methods beyond correlation have made clear that this is a causal relationship. At least part of it's a causal relationship. It's not just that happy people go into it, get more education, but education actually is able to make people happier by making their lives better. Right? So it's also, if something is going to influence well-being, it's then going to create differences in well-being. So the very fact that education pays off a lot means that you end up with some inequalities along lines of educational attainment. So this is data from David Autor, U.S. earnings of adults, and it's the cumulative change since 1963, so we're talking 60 years, in weekly wages of people with different levels of education. Okay, so on the left is men, on the right is women, and you probably can't read the legend, but it's kind of as you might guess. The lowest line is people who have dropped out of high school. They didn't finish secondary school at all, so they didn't finish compulsory education. Next line up is they did finish high school. Then they have some college but didn't earn a BA, and then did earn a BA, and then got graduate education. Right? And so all of this is normed at, let's just set them to 0 at the beginning of this period, and what's the proportional growth in each? So how much did inequality grow? So earnings for those with a graduate degree in 2017 were 60% higher than they had been in 1963. This is men. For high school dropouts, there is basically a drop for a while, and there's been some recovery really recently, but 0, essentially, no growth for people who don't have a high school degree. So you can see here this widening, right, of these gaps. So education is one of the dimensions along which we saw growing inequality in the 80s, 90s, aughts. And even mostly into the present, there's been some reversal in the US where after COVID, especially at the bottom of the earnings distribution, we've seen some growth where we had not. And I don't know if that's worldwide or if that's just a US phenomenon. Women, the story is similar, but not quite as stark. You don't see this, negative territory on the high school dropouts, and the differences aren't quite as large. This is in part because of a glass ceiling, which means, women can only get so high, which means that the inequality only gets so high in their earnings. So these trends have caught a lot of attention in economics and in policy because these differences in earnings create real differences in well-beings and in opportunities, and they create political frictions. You might perhaps have heard that we have some political frictions in the United States right now. And the way all of this links to mobility, so how much intergenerational mobility is there? To what degree do we have like a caste system in which there's a set of folks who permanently are in the upper class and a set of folks who are permanently in the lower class? Well, it's whether there's mobility in this. If you're born to somebody who has these earnings, are you likely to end up here? Or are you just as likely to end up somewhere else in the distribution? That would be high mobility, right? If your parents' economic situation doesn't predict your own. Fact is, all across the world, there is a strong correlation between parents and children in their education levels, and it's one of the vehicles through which inequality is transmitted from one generation to another. It's also potentially an opportunity for breaking that chain, because if we can get people whose parents had low levels of education to go to university, potentially to go to an elite university, then that has the potential to shake up the class system a bit. What we have seen is that in the US, over time, we've seen, worldwide, we've seen enormous increases in education, but they are quite unequal, right? So if there was going to be playing a large equalizing force, you'd want to see more action from the bottom than from the top. That is definitely not what we're seeing. So first, let me just show you how big the rises have been over time, and then I'll show you how they differ by family income of one's parents. So this is from census data, and so we have year of birth going back to the 20s. The top line in blue is what share of that birth cohort went to college by age 25. Had they touched college by age 25? These numbers might look high. That's because college in the US includes further education, right? So when I talk about college in the US, we're talking about universities. We're also talking about 2-year colleges. where people, it's not apprenticeships, but it is certificates and anything that's sort of post-secondary training. So as you can see, the participation rate is quite high. All these people are not getting BAs. In fact, these are the numbers for the BAs. So around, it's varied over time, but about half of those people who go to some sort of college end up getting a BA, okay? And the attendance has risen a lot faster than has the BA itself, right? And so the dropout rate has risen over time considerably. So in the US, a lot of people try college and don't actually end up with any kind of degree. There's another kind of degree, a 2-year degree that people get in the further education and the community colleges. And that's never been as large. And it's basically at 10, they only started in the 70s, so we're starting at a later date here. 14% of the population has an AA, 37% has a BA, so only half of people in the US have some sort of degree. More have a credential. When we set our policy goals to make things attainable, we start talking about credentials instead of just degrees. And so short-term certificates are becoming more common, but the evidence is not there that they actually produce any benefits. They produce a credential, something on paper, but whether they pay off in terms of labor market outcomes is quite up in the air at this point. It's the degrees that we know produce benefits in terms of health, wealth, well-being, and all that. And the other thing to make clear from this, when we're in a bubble in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Cambridge, England, London, everybody has a BA. Too many people are going to college because everybody has a BA. We are a highly segregated society. US as well as England, and the people who have the BAs tend to cluster together in cities where it does indeed appear everyone's got a BA, but everyone does not. 63% of the population in the US does not have a BA. Okay, so we are by no means at saturation in the labor market for university training. Mm-hmm. And if there are any questions for clarity, please let me know. Don't suffer through and then tell me at the end. Can you go back to slide 1 and tell me what that was? Because that would not be useful. All right, so tell me now. This is where I'm supposed to pause. I'm at a school of education. I'm trying to develop my pedagogical skills. Okay, economics didn't teach them to me. So, okay. So just as a quick vocabulary lesson, I've already touched on some of this, but what these phrases mean in the UK versus the US system, and you can correct me if I've mangled these, but higher ed, right, is where people get BAs and master's degrees and PhDs and other further degrees. And so in the US, this includes 4-year colleges that don't have, a university is a place that has graduate degrees. Choose 4-year colleges that just do the BA. It's a mix of mostly public and nonprofit. Harvard's a nonprofit. University of Michigan is a public institution. About 10% of the undergraduate enrollment is in private nonprofit institutions. And then it's for-profit. So you might have heard of University of Phoenix. That's sort of the biggest one that people know about. And that's a new entry in the past couple of decades. But those grant BAs as well. And they're especially active in the further ed. So quite a few for-profit institutions in the further ed category. Some granting the AA, but many doing these certificates that I said we're not sure about the payoff to them. They're not regulated in any way. Right? There's a certification process for an institution to offer an AA or a BA. Right? There's inspections and accreditation, all this stuff, and the certificates are whatever you want them to be. They're defined by the institution, and it's a piece of paper, and that's it. There's really no, except in the case where they're for something like electricians. Those are regulated, right? They're making sure that the people who claim to be electricians actually are given a set training. Nursing assistants. So some of this stuff is regulated, but whether you are considered, a Microsoft Windows network specialist is pretty much not a regulated certificate. Okay, So that's our vocab. This became relevant to me the first time I came here to talk about college, and I showed folks this picture, and they were thinking that this was university only. And it's like, I asked, so that, I was like, the dropout rate in the US is roughly 50%. And what is it here? And they're like, 0, roughly, to an approximation, because they were thinking of the elite institutions as opposed to including further education when thinking about what the leakage was. So learning about this was important to me. In the US, these two sectors are treated the same from a policy perspective. All of our funding, our grant funding, our loans, operate through the same system for further ed and for university, which causes problems. So what is appropriate for funding for somebody who is an unemployed worker who needs to tool up their skills to get back into the labor force might not be appropriate for somebody who's pursuing a graduate degree in business administration. Here I'm thinking of state loans, for example. So I think it's kind of crazy to have an unemployed person who we're supposed to have a safety net for taking out loans to build back their skills. But that's what we do. And this causes I'll go into it more towards the end, but this causes issues in terms of risk and participation. All right, so inequality, that's what I'm here about. So measuring income inequality in adult outcomes is difficult because you need to track people. Either you have a longitudinal survey and you ask them questions when they're young and you talk to their parents and then you follow up later. Super expensive. They're small. Each country tends to have 1 or 2 of them. Or you're doing nifty things like the Scandinavian countries where you're linking administrative data and you're able to see the parent and the child and look at their earnings over time. We have not gotten to that latter world quite yet. Raj Chetty and his group have managed to do some of this using IRS data. It's not complete. It's used tax data. It doesn't include race, for example, which in the US context is a very important dividing line. But this is from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. And it's a survey that was fielded twice, once for people born 79 to 82, once for people born 61 to 60. It's actually a broader range, but I'm presenting these 3. It's about 5 or 6 years in each of them. They're supposed to be doing a new one soon. I don't know what happened with their contract with the federal government and if it's going to be continuing, but everything I've shown you so far is at risk in terms of us knowing the future. So, these graphs that I'm showing you, I anticipate there being a discontinuity, a blip, a hole for the next few years where the data is not of the same quality if it exists at all. So the US Department of Education has basically been dismantled. Happy to talk, well, not happy. I will talk about that as much as you wish. Harvard's also being dismantled. But anyway, so this is income differences in childhood. And then in adulthood, what education looks like. So look at somebody when they're in their early teens and divvy up the income distribution of families into quartiles, top quartile, bottom quartile, and then plot the share of them that touch college. That was that top line that I showed you in the previous graphs using census data. So for the cohort born in 61 to 64, those born into the lowest quartile, 19% of them went to college, as opposed to those in the highest quartile, where 58% of them went to college, right? And rounding error means these things are not quite right in terms of the differences, but over time, over these birth cohorts, we saw that growth. So here's that growth as a shift up in this line. And pretty much, you can squint, but it's kind of a shift in parallel. So it's not, if this thing had gotten steeper, that would have indicated greater inequality in attendance. But, it kind of shifted up. You can argue about this, and people do. But the gap went from 39 to 51 percentage points. Most of the growth was towards the top of the income distribution. But this is just attendance. This is, did you touch college, right? And remember what the earnings graphs looked like. It was the BA and the master's that made the real difference. And by the way, I'm a first gen. My dad was a high school dropout. I'm somewhere down here in this cohort. I was born in '65, so right around here is me. About a fifth of my schoolmates would have gone to college. Here's the BA, and it's a different picture, right? So remember I said we still have this sort of shifting up, but we have a rotation, right? It's getting steeper. And so you look at this and it actually, inequality has grown worse in whether people get a BA or not. So there's been very little growth at the bottom, went from 5% for my cohort. I had no idea about this until I grew up and started studying such things, that these numbers were so low. So 5% for my cohort, 9% for the next cohort. This was during a time that public policy was, this is the war on poverty, or public policy, the introduction of financial aid, grants for college, need-based grants for college, introduction of student loans, a real effort to try to level the playing field in terms of education. And it didn't do a whole lot in terms of post-secondary attainment. Maybe it would have been worse, but it certainly didn't flatten the relationship. Just about, a lot of the growth in getting a BA is coming from the top, and from not, it's going from 36%, up to 54%. That's these two quartiles are where the real action is, especially women. So women are driving a lot of this. I'm not showing the gender differences because it'll too many rabbit holes to go down, but it's women that are showing the largest increases in post-secondary education. And this is just to return to why that BA, focus on the BA that I'm making. It's because it's way up here, and that is, that's the graduate degree. You need to get a BA to get a graduate degree, right? So, here's the BA, and then down here is the some college. It's closer to the high school grads than it is to the BA earners, at least in the US, okay? So we'd like to increase mobility, intergenerational mobility, or some of us would like to, by getting more low-income kids to go to college, complete college. What's happened in the US? And I'm going to do a blitz through what's gone wrong. I was here about 3 years ago at a policy conference on education, and I said I was providing cautionary tales about the United States, and I'm back with more. Boy, do we have cautionary tales in the United States of what can go wrong in the system. So first caution, college is not college is not college. Colleges are highly differentiated. And that's true. It's not so true in, say, Norway, but it's true in the UK, and it's true in the United States. You've got Cambridge and Oxford and Harvard and Yale, and then you've got the local community colleges or the local four-year kind of regional institution. And in the US, that translates into massive differences in spending per pupil, where the spending per pupil is much lower for those who actually have the greatest need. So we spend the most on the kids who have the best academic preparation and the least on those who have the worst academic preparation. It's the flip of what we see in K-12. Right? The second they leave high school, all of a sudden we perceive that the spending per pupil we need for low income, for disadvantaged kids, drops by 70%. Right, so that's what happens when you transition from secondary to further education. So spending per pupil, vast differences, like orders of magnitude differences across the sector, differences in endowment, which help to drive the differences in spending per pupil, differences in the faculty to student ratio. What share of the faculty have PhDs, are full-time, what share of the students are full-time. So differences in peer scores and demographics, highly stratified in terms of the college quality, and the outputs reflect this. So the graduation rates, what share of those people who start in getting a degree, for the community colleges, it's around 15% of those who start at a community college end up getting an AA degree within 3 years. It's supposed to be a 2-year degree. So 150% of time, it's 15%. For those starting a BA at a 4-year college, the grad rate is as high as 100%, 95% at places like Harvard, Michigan, down to single digits at some institutions. Okay, so it's not unusual that each city would have some institution that's got grad rates of 10%. Okay, and people have taken out loans for that fast dropout, which means that the risk of all of this falls on the student quite heavily. Of this variation, the consequences of it going wrong lie heavily on the student. We do not have as developed a system of student loan forgiveness or income-based repayment in the US as we do here. In fact, there have been, the courts have been throwing it out right and left. And so we have students who went to college and borrowed, being promised a certain income contingent system and loan forgiveness, and then it's been yanked out from them now by the courts, and they're having their wages garnished with quite high payment amounts. So not good. The outputs, graduation rates, earnings, and occupation and prestige, right? So you think about, what's the difference between, Harvard and, I'll pick on Ohio State University because that's where J.D. Vance went, right? So the difference between them, the graduation rates are different, but the big difference is that Harvard, Yale, the other Ivies are enormous barriers to the political, economic, social elite. If you look at what share of Supreme Court justices came from the Ivy League, what share of Congress, of editors of the major magazines, of people who are intellectual influencers, it's stunning numbers. So Chetty's group has some numbers on what this looks like. I suspect it's quite similar here. Right? So these institutions, the top institutions, I don't think what's relevant is, this is not about getting people a BA, get them to Cambridge to make sure they get a BA. It's to get the people to Cambridge so that the elite is somewhat more representative of our country, and it's not kind of an ossified subset of people, right? And so in the US, the low-income kids are in the community colleges. They're in the less selective public colleges. They're in the for-profits. You will not find a high-income kid in a for-profit school. The high-income kids are in the more selective 4 years and in the very elite institutions. Now, there's a bit more attention to the elite institutions than I think there should be, and for the wrong reasons, but I'll say in a moment why I think that public policy needs to pay some attention. Oh, I'm going to say it right here, right? So, the mass education, the further education, the less selective 4 years, we're talking, that's 80%, 90% of undergraduates. If we're talking about actually increasing schooling levels across the economy, making our economy more skilled, then those are the institutions that matter. And what drives me crazy is when Congress does post-secondary policy with anecdotes about Harvard. Right? Because what goes on at Harvard is completely irrelevant to most institutions in the country. Anecdotes play a big role, especially if most of Congress went to Harvard or Yale, right? This is a side effect of having this sort of persistent stratification, is that you end up with people in Congress who all have the same life experiences and can't understand how the world actually works. So in mass education, what we need to bump up is those completion rates. We've gotten quite good at access. So as you saw, 68% of the birth cohorts is going to college in some way. So I would call that access. Completion is the margin along which we're seeing great variation across the institutions. And that's where a lot of the focus in the US is right now. And lots and lots of evidence on what works and what doesn't. I've got a couple of handbook chapters in the Economics of Education handbook that look at what's the relationship between money and college completion. What's the difference? What's the relationship between advising and supports, quality of instruction, and affordability on whether people complete college or not. So I think the policy focus, at least in the US, needs to be on making it a quality education. This also affects the payoff. If you do graduate, how much does that degree pay off? Right? One way to get graduation rates very high is for institutions to lower standards completely. That would not be great for actually training students, right? So we want both people to complete and the degree to be worth something in the labor force. How are the elite colleges relevant? Well, they shouldn't be allowed to drive post-sec policy in the sense that they should not be what we have in our minds when we're thinking about how to structure school in such a way that it works for the median student or the bottom quartile of students. It's irrelevant. We do need to get access to them for the talented disadvantaged kids, right? And because they are gatekeepers to the elite in a really important way, and there's causal evidence showing this is the case. That if a low-income kid just gets into Harvard or another Ivy, they are substantially more likely to end up being a judge or a CEO or in one of those elite positions. So it matters, and they don't do it on their own. These institutions do not make these things happen without public pressure. So Harvard, Yale, so forth, Stanford would be quite happy to be a club for the richest folks, right? And they kind of are if you look at the numbers. And the only time they've done any real work in trying to get there's tokens. I worry that I've been a token. I went to Harvard as an undergraduate, right? So was that tokenism, or was it a real effort to increase the numbers? You need to use public shaming. So put the numbers out there. What share of people at each institution are first gen, come from low-income families, are are immigrants, right? Make the numbers quite public. Regulation, quotas, affirmative action, which we don't have anymore. And then there's also on the student side, very intense advising and mentoring can help students to get to the point where they're prepared enough and can apply to these institutions. But what we found, Chetty, Deming, and Friedman did work that absolutely, it was wonderful work, but it enraged me because it showed that for students, that low-income students who were applying to these institutions were disadvantaged in the admissions process relative to very wealthy students, conditional on academic preparation. If you looked at the likelihood that a high-income kid would get in and their low-income peer would get in or middle-income peer would get in with the same the high-income kid had a thumb on the scale. So they're not going to do this on their own, right? They need to be watched and they need to be pressured to make sure that these riches that they've accumulated over the centuries are actually distributed equally in our society. Don't try to expand tertiary on the cheap. I've seen this in every country whose history of post-secondary education I've looked at. They start out with a set of high-quality four-year institutions, universities that might be 1,000 years old, right? And then when it comes time to expand access, you start seeing a proliferation of cheaper and sometimes fly-by-night institutions. That's definitely what we've seen in the US. What we see from the US was that, first the government was building and funding new colleges, right? So the 1860s forward, very intensive effort to develop four-year publics in the West as the country spread out. In the 1970s, added in the community colleges. These places had very high government subsidies and low tuition rates. Okay. Recently, if you go back the last 10, 20 years, you've seen cuts in this funding and this perception that the institution should be self-financed, which education is not going to be self-financed, right? It is a social policy. It is a service that government provides because it benefits the economy. So we've seen cuts in the subsidies to these institutions, which have decreased quality, they've decreased capacity, led to rising tuition prices and a real shift towards using student loans instead of low tuition. And they've led directly to a for-profit expansion because constraint in the public sector means that there's demand, but there's still the grants out there. So there's student demand, but there's not good institutional institutions for students to go to. So they go to for-profits instead. You can see this relationship in the data very clearly. And the outcomes are quite bad. They have to borrow much more to go to a for-profit institution. The tuition rates are as high as they are at places like Harvard. The outcomes are really awful, and people tend to default on their student loans, right? So, and as far as we can tell, they have zero earnings benefits. So literally using the tax data and looking at the universe of students who've gone to these institutions, many of whom are older students. So you can see their earnings before and their earnings after. At the community colleges, you see a bump up in their earnings after they finish community college. Yay, right? That's what we want to see. For the for-profits, flat, so zero. But they're coming out with huge buckets of loans. And I think it's government's responsibility to make sure this kind of thing does not happen, especially with government funds. Okay. You can see I'm banging on about this because I think it's important. So that's just all the same things. You can guess who's at the for-profits and what the impact is on the wealth gap, for example. All right. Student loans, bad. I'm being quite direct now. Student loans are a bad idea in further ed. Australia tried this for a while, adding the training institutions to their loan portfolio, and total disaster. And so they backed off on that. I don't know if it's something being discussed here. Traditionally in the US, community college was free and people didn't borrow in order to go to community college. They borrowed to go to four-year institutions starting in like the 80s, but not at the further education institutions. That changed during the Great Recession. So like 14, 15 years ago, with all the cuts that happened because tax revenues were down, tuition went up, people started borrowing in order to go to further education, and the results were quite bad. So here's some statistics on what share of the cohort has defaulted on its loans. So we don't have universal income contingent loans. People pay like you pay your mortgage on a monthly basis, you pay your loans. This is the share of students exiting from school in 2000 and in 2010 during the Great Recession who defaulted on their loans, which means they paid nothing for at least a year. The definition moves around, and so, the very selective 4 years, the default rate is very low and it barely budged during the recession, went from 5% to 6%. These are the folks that, great, use student loans to fund their education. It seems to work. They pay for themselves in this case, right? The loans go out, the loans come back in with a bit extra interest. Some of that can be used to cross-subsidize other people. The for-profits and the community colleges, the level has always been very high, 18% defaulting. In the US, defaulting on your loan means your credit rating takes a huge hit. You have a hard time getting a mortgage, getting a car loan, getting an apartment, getting some jobs, which depend on credit ratings, for example. It's kind of like being a felon when it comes to your outcomes. And during the recession, huge increases. So a third of the people who were coming in and taking loans for further education were defaulting on them. Some of these were forgiven and some of them were not. But whether or not they were forgiven, going into default has quite an impact on people's financial lives. So, and honestly, if this many people can't repay their loans in these sectors, it's probably more efficient to make it a grant than to run this whole administration of loans in order to collect pennies on the dollar, right? Yep.
Just a quick one. Aren't the graduates or participants at the bottom of your chart more likely to be helped out by the parents?
Of course. This is part of the stratification. Yeah. So they've got cushions of various sorts. So they have their own safety nets, the parental safety nets. All right. And finally, just to close, inequality. How all of this translates into differences in well-being is a policy choice, right? So I think there was a time, an optimistic time, where economists, policymakers, the neoliberals, make education a vehicle for income mobility, and that will solve inequality. Because people will, invest in themselves, and that will reduce, we'll get more and more people going to college, we'll get more people getting BAs, that'll shrink, increase supply, that means the returns go down and we'll start to see equalizing. This was a very naive view of the world, and this is what the economists had in mind. It didn't really work real well. So just to give you a context of what's been happening to earnings inequality, income inequality in the US. So here we're starting in 1980. This is from Zuckman's and Saez's World Income Database. So the top 1% of the income distribution in 1980 had about 11% of the income. So top 1% were getting 11% of the income. That went up to 20% by 2015, right? Nearly doubling. The bottom 50% had 21% of income in 1980, and that went down to 13%. Okay, so scissors. We see this in China, Brazil, a whole bunch of highly unequal societies, this trend over time. By contrast, This is Western Europe. And they're starting out in about the same place. I'll put them next to each other so you can see that the initial starting points are kind of in the same place, but they diverged quite a bit. They took different paths, facing the same technological change, right? Facing the same revolutions in industrial production and in information technology, but took different paths in how the gains of that growth were distributed. And predict, you can you don't know what the future is going to bring, but if we take the global inequality and we can come up with some scenarios where, if everyone does what the US does, here's where we think the top 1% will be in terms of their income share. And here's where the bottom 50% would be in their income share. If they all follow their own trend, here's where we'd be in the middle. And if they all use the EU approaches, there's the much lower level of inequality and less growth over time. Okay, and what are the policy parameters? Well, for the top 1%, that's not about access to university. That's about wealth. This is about, the last lecture was about this, taxation of income and wealth. It's about aftermarket interventions. So education is a pre-market intervention. Taxation is an aftermarket intervention. Redistribution, social policies, wage policies, all seem to matter for the other 99% in particular. Right, so for the other 99% of the population, education matters. Wage policies matter, minimum wages, unions, public investments. Economists were very slow to recognize all of this stuff, and many still have not. And that is the end.
Thanks very much, Susan. I certainly am really curious both to hear what everyone has to say about that. I've got a lot of questions myself, but kind of predominantly on how this relates to the US. I certainly saw, to the UK, sorry, I certainly saw a lot of similarities, but also differences, I think, in how things have panned out here and how the policy is tied into that. So I'll hand over.
Okay. Am I on? Yeah. Oh, great. Okay. Thank you. And thank you, Sue. That was great. And to the Stone Centre for having me along. You've heard a great talk with lots of slides. It's a warm night, and I'm between you and the booze. So I'm going to keep this quite short. There's lots of things I've just heard, which I hope we maybe in discussion we can do exactly what you just said, Bethany, and talk about some of the differences as well as a lot of the similarities. And a lot of what you said rang really true, but some things are different. But I'm going to use my few minutes, I think, because we're here in London, to try and sort of take the theme of tonight and to sort of, I guess, take it to the UK and specifically England, given we're in this sort of devolved world, to the English context, and to focus on policy, which is kind of my hinterland, I suppose. I will speak about views I've got for myself from policy, but I'm also going to draw on a number of bits of research which the Nuttall Foundation, my organisation, has funded over the years. And in a way, sort of Sue started at the top down, if you like, in terms of kind of higher universities, and then sort of broadened out. And I guess I'm going to go the other way and start with people who were kind of furthest from that and then build up, if that makes sense. Because I think, given that you've chosen to come on a sunny night to a lecture on inequality post-16, you will know that, like you've heard in the US, in the UK, the mass expansion of HE increased in lots of different ways inequalities in our countries. In our country, it benefited those from more comfortable backgrounds the most. You probably also know, although not everyone does, is that our school system, I would say at age 15, which is the age at which a lot of international comparators take place, is not the best in the world by any means, but it's strong, actually, compared to lots of countries. It's strong. It has significant weaknesses, particularly at the bottom, but it is a reasonable performer at age 15 and can kind of hold its own, if you like. Where we collapse, and that sounds dramatic, but I think that is basically justified, is post-15, that if you look 16 to 24 as the usual time periods, we go from being quite strong to really bad. something really bad happens in that age spectrum. And the kind of fact that lots of people use, which is striking, is that we're the only country in the OECD, although the US is just about the same. So we probably the last two people who should be sat up here, which are the people from other countries. But we're the only country in the OECD where the percentage of people who have very low levels of literacy and numeracy is just as bad amongst the young as it is amongst the people in their 50s and 60s, according to the OECD at least. So we have problems. Now, I'm going to just sort of take to policy. Rather than just kind of polishing the problems, I want to put 5 propositions out there based on my experience in terms of policy direction, which are some of which are kind of quite live. And I spend a bit of my time in Whitehall still, so some of these things are quite live. One is NEETs, young people who are not in education, employment and training. So furthest away, if you like, from the world of elite universities. I mean, this just is a really bad situation in the country. The numbers are high. They're not they've been high before, but we have 1 million people, roughly speaking, who are NEET. We have about almost 16% of our 18 to 24s. So you're getting on for what 1 in 6 of our young people are in that position. That's really bad in itself. It's different, though, I think, to in the past. People will say that. I think this is different. The people who are in that position today are further away from the world of work and the world of education than their median counterpart 20 years ago. They're more likely to be inactive than they are to be unemployed. They're even further away from having had any qualification. So, and the response, I think, has to be more complicated, which is not a good thing to say in policy world, because people don't like complicated things. But you can't just be a kind of, in the past, I was involved in designing programs which were all about there's weak demand in the economy and you're just subsidizing employers to take people on because there's a kind of demand problem. That we have a chronic problem in relation to young people in that position, and we need to blend together mental health support with emotional support, with training, with significant job subsidy in a new way. And government is struggling with that. That's a really live conversation, and frankly, nothing else matters in my view if we don't make progress in that. If we care about post-16 inequalities, because these people are the biggest problem. The biggest problem to the taxpayer for the next 30 years, but they also have the most limited opportunities in our nation. So that's number one. Number two is, if we're serious about this issue, we have to fund further education, right? People have said that for decades. The problem has gone backwards, generally speaking. We froze the per person, broadly speaking, froze it for quite a bit of the 2010s. The typical pay of your FE lecturer is just like really significantly behind the typical pay of a teacher. And many teachers would say their typical pay is pretty low. Retention rates are just much worse, and so on. This is just, I could go on. This is a massive issue, and if you care about inequalities, you have to care about this issue, and you have to prioritize it. And the flicker of good news is that in the spending review last week, actually, one of the there was, and I don't want to overstate how big this was, but it's unusual to see the FE budget go up by more than the school's budget. It did. That is very, very unusual in this country. It rarely happens. It's just happened. So I think the government, not some people noticed it, but not many people did. I think that's really significant. Partly it's because we're going to have more 16 to 19-year-olds, but it wasn't just that. It was a choice. Third, apprenticeships. If we care about inequality post-16, we have to get real about how we prioritize apprenticeship funding. In this country, over the last 15 years, we've just seen this massive change in who apprenticeships are for, fundamentally. And that has seen a really big kind of upward redistribution of opportunity towards people who are higher skilled and older. Now, I've got nothing against older people. I'm an older person. I've got nothing against people, older people getting access to apprenticeships. And you can make a case for people at really quite advanced levels getting into apprenticeships, and good luck to them. In a world of limited, scarce resources, that is absolutely not the top priority in my view. And the government should be quite dirigiste, and this is deeply unpopular in the business department and various other places, but they should be quite dirigiste in earmarking some of the money from what used to be the apprenticeship levy and saying that is going to be for younger people. And we cannot have a position where ever fewer younger people are getting access to these opportunities. We've funded quite a lot of qualitative research focus groups talking to young people about who are quite far from level 4, 5 and above education in this country, and that they narrate that apprenticeships are not for working class people like me. They just spontaneously sat there for older, richer people. One part of the UK has taken a different approach and has earmarked funding, which is the Northern Ireland, for younger apprentices, and they have not seen the same trends, not surprisingly. So it can be done. The fourth thing I would say, and this doesn't get the attention it deserves, is that the level of mismatch between students and where they go to college is a real issue. I think have you done work on this? I think I may have seen a reference from
Yes.
So I think you've done work in the US and with people have sort of done similar studies in the UK. So by mismatch, I mean people with a given level of qualification, more disadvantaged people with a given level of academic credentials are just much more likely to apply to a institution where they're kind of overqualified compared to their better off counterparts. This is quite a big thing. I mean, this is not a small effect, it's quite a big effect. And that means, so they're applying to places which are less academically selective and less likely to give them a career-long earnings boost.
I'll be talking about this on Friday at the conference.
There you go.
Can we advertise the conference, or is it a closed?
I'm
right,
sure
very
you
good.
can. So this is a real thing. It's hard to change, but I mean, it gets into how you shape aspiration in secondary schools, but it also gets into things like maintenance. People, working class people are less likely to apply for things further away if maintenance is inadequate and so on. So there's just kind of, and that is a significant part of the problem. And I'm going on, so I'm just going to touch on my last one, which again often gets overlooked, but is just, I think, really key, is that if you want a public policy sweet spot in terms of if you care about inequality and you really care about productivity, I don't mind, but you should care about both. One of the best sort of avenues to pursue is getting significantly more people in this country to take sort of sub-degree level qualifications, level 4, level 5, HND, HNCs. Not all of them pay off, but a lot of them do. And we are very weird as a country for how few people we have at that qualification level, given the structure of our economy. So if you do, people at the LSE have done good work on this, trying to do a kind of, given our structure. So this isn't saying, why can't we be Germany or something? This is sort of saying, given the sectoral composition of our economy, then you look at other nations, other economies who succeed in those same sectors, and then you look at the skill mix that they have, the qualification mix of people working in them, we are just look really quite strange. And it's, we have at levels 4 and levels 5, last time I looked at it, we had 8 or 9% of our prime age workforce were at that level. If you look at other liberal market economies, you're talking 18 to 30%. We are an outlier on that. And that is a bad thing for lots of people who are peaking, if you like, at level 2 or level 3. I hope people know what I'm talking about when I say level 2. Level 3 is... So level 2 is a kind of 5 GCSE equivalent. Level 3 is...
Well, that clarifies.
Yeah.
No,
it doesn't. That's where you're supposed to get to at the age 16 in this country. And level 3 is, and this is using very academic terms, where if you did A levels, you would get, if you did a few A levels at a reasonable level, that's where you'd get to. So levels 4 and levels 5 are the bit beyond, if you like, where you might get to at age 19, but below a BA. Okay, so it's that kind of in between space that we're very bad at, and we have lots and lots of young people who peak at the kind of where you should get to by age 16. And maybe they might take more years to get there, but they stop at that point and they don't progress in a way that they would in other countries from the ages of 18 to their mid-20s. And they pay a massive price, and we collectively pay a massive price because of our failure on that front. So they are some of my kind of like, if you were really serious, if you were a government that was serious about closing inequalities in post-16 provision, and you didn't act on those things, then you're not serious, in my view. So that's a kind of English/UK perspective. A lot of these points would land in Scotland, all of them. And I hope we can touch on some of the similarities and differences with the US too. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to pick up on what I thought was kind of a commonality or perhaps a contrast between what you both were saying. Susan, you mentioned that in some of the outcomes for not quite bachelor's degree education, not a 4-year degree, we just don't see the benefits in the same way. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what it is about 4-year degrees that are transformative in terms of outcomes, and perhaps you might want to build on this from a UK perspective as well. What we can do at the community college level and at the kind of HMD level to actually make them work as vehicles for improving outcomes.
Well, that's not a big question at all. Why do universities work in
Yeah.
building people's skills and improving their lives? There's lots of hypotheses about this, but one that we've seen some empirical support for is that that the universities, the 4-year institutions, teach people to learn, right? And you might think that, say, getting a BA in history is not going to pay off, and you might be better off getting a BA in electrical engineering or an AA in HVAC, right? And what you see is that indeed, first going to labor force, the history major is making a lot less, but the growth over time in the BA is much more consistent and large, and their job switching and the moving up in jobs is much more consistent. And part of this is we too often teach very narrow skills, which are outdated quickly. Technological change is so rapid that if you don't learn to learn, you're going to have a hard time adjusting, and you'll be displaced. Where so David Deming has some nice work on this, but this is by no means a settled question.
Yeah. Gavin, is that a problem for HNDs, and can it be overcome within those kind of?
I think people have a kind of dated view of what some of these things can be. I mean, there's also like a lot of David Soskies who's an academic, is quite good on this in terms of just like there's a lot of kind of roles, whether it's kind of an IT, kind of intermediate management, senior nursing. There might be kind of a management component to it, which you can learn skills which you can apply and adapt. It's not just like people sort of think it's like the level I get to be an electrician and you just learn one thing and then you get sort of overtaken by events. So I think it is actually making professionalizing how we think about kind of having a senior role which involves management and leadership and emotional support and kind of leading teams and so on. It's quite often what the step up, if you like, in a level 4, level 5. So I don't really buy the kind of what's the point that you wouldn't say this, but some will say, some of that a robot will come or something for a lot of those sorts of roles. I also think, there is. So when I've always been kind of apologetic in my support for high levels of participation in higher education, and I was involved in a lot of that 20 odd years ago in government. But it is, I think, there is an interesting debate about the kind of returns at the lower ends of HE. And in the context of high fees and high borrowing for maintenance, you are seeing people with large stock of debt at the end of that period. And at the lower end, the returns are not great, right? I mean, I'm a big supporter on average. Stepping to HE is a really good thing. But then, and so there is, and I think we would benefit from having other more attractive, more marketed qualifications, which would be sort of below the full degree level, where people would have more of a sense of choice, particularly with a different price tag attached to them. There's a question then about how you fund that, and there's to get into the kind of idea of what's the boundary of where loans work well and work less well in terms of the qualification level. Because this country, we're moving towards more loans.
I've noticed that.
Stretching out, and that's a relative. It's not completely new, but it's at a larger scale.
That's why I brought it up.
So I think it's an interesting discussion, and it kind of depends on your counterfactual. If people are going to get the charge the fees, and there's no loan, then they kind of they can't go on all of them. So there's a sort of it depends what.
There's something in the middle, which is bursaries and grants and so forth.
That's a nice world.
I
like that world. I like that world too. But I think basically there is a role for different types of provision, sub-degree and degree upwards. I'm quite optimistic that most of that being worked well from the individual's point of view. But I think to do a bit more competition amongst kind of sub-degree, close to degree qualifications, which might work better for some.
Yeah, absolutely. Now I'm gonna open the floor to some questions. Hopefully, people have thoughts. Please raise your hand. Please. We've got a roving mic that's going to come over. Hold it up there.
Thank you. Thanks for the fascinating talk. So I was really interested in the statistics on dropout, which I found really striking. And I think also on the heterogeneity in the returns to a college degree across institutions. And there is another dimension of heterogeneity I'm really interested in. It's universities' ability to make disadvantaged students specifically succeed. So I know that in the US, for instance, Raj Chetty, whose work you cited several times, has computed social mobility rates by university. And in the UK, the IFS has reproduced these. And we've seen that there is massive heterogeneity across institutions in their ability to make these specific disadvantaged students to reach the top of the income distribution. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on so I'm at Queen Mary University, who is one of the universities with the highest social mobility rate in England. So do you have any thoughts on what makes some universities specifically effective at teaching and promoting social mobility for disadvantaged students? Because I don't really know what makes some universities especially good.
This is where why I was going into the quality discussion. So it may be less of an issue here, but the inputs are enormously variable in the US, and the institutions that have very few resources are the ones that tend to enroll the most low-income students. So these mobility indices for the universities are a function of two things. Among the low-income students that you have, how many of them do you move into the upper levels of the income distribution, and how many of them do you have? So Harvard, for the tiny handful of people, of low-income students it admits, does great, but it doesn't make a dent in the numbers. But the City University of New York does. So that's why I was saying the broad access institutions are where we're really going to be affecting well-being and inequality writ large in the economy. It's not going to happen in the elite institutions. And I think there's no getting away from it. Needs to be a good education. I mean, we talk about this all the time in K-12, and we seem to manipulate policy parameters in a way that we think is about making education better. When it comes to post-sec, we tend to just talk about the price. Is it free? Is it a loan? Is it a grant? But is the teaching high quality? Are the resources distributed appropriately? And I think pretty much for those budding researchers in the room, or not budding, old researchers, it's an important topic, like the education production function in post-secondary education. If you think of all the questions that we've answered in K-12, class size and peer effects and the effective facilities and all the spending per student on student outcomes, and then look at the same question in post-sec, it's unanswered. And that means we have very little evidence on which to base any of our decisions about how to improve quality in post-secondary education. And it's a real gap in the research.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have great answers to what university, what happens inside the black box of a university to sort of solve this. I'm always struck by the fact that there are, and we've sort of seen this through the kind of linked administered data that people can now use. There's some universities who are kind of good or bad at getting working class people to succeed within different types of courses compared to their more affluent counterparts with the same qualifications, prior levels of attainment. So it's how good are you within the university era at kind of equalizing? And then there's what happens to those people when they meet the labor market? And it's not, some people are really good at at trying to help working class people kind of progress at the same pace, if you like, as the better off counterparts. Other universities seems to do better at at ensuring that their people, when they meet the labor market, do well. And I'd be interested to know why that is, but I don't know the answer.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that the kind of differences between course choices and provision in universities that have better access, basically. And obviously in the UK, we have university degree requirement qualifications for such a wide range of vocations, many of which are not particularly well paid, and which will be more likely to be attended by a lower income student. So there's that kind of dynamic as well, I think. Any more questions? Yeah, we've got someone here and here. Okay, brilliant. Oh.
Hi, you discussed, Susan, about how these elite universities in the US, you can think of the Ivies, sort of have this clubby feature and have sort of an elite self-production built into them that they would probably lean into more if they did not have pressure from the public policy. But not to say I agree with anything that Trump's doing in terms of politicizing the tax exemption in the case of Harvard, but is there sort of, or how do you think about the sort of public finance question, or the in terms of the public welfare of these tax exemption from elite institutions as a sort of, yeah, a continued accelerator or reinforcer of inequality, and whether there's actually any sort of non just politicized ways thinking about that issue as a financing mechanism to equalize education in other aspects?
So I've long talked about this and said that the elites are not carrying out their social responsibilities, given the advantages they have in terms of taxes and the wealth that they've accrued over time with basically government assistance. And I said that the pitchforks and the torches are going to come if we don't fix this, and they have, right? So we are now quite vulnerable, and it hasn't been. The endowment tax was imposed a few years ago, a small tax on endowment income, but now we're having sledgehammers taken to university funding, and so this resentment is being used as leverage for destroying science in the U.S. So we screwed up royally. There you go.
Gavin, can you extend that to the UK, where obviously we've had a kind of changing narrative around the state responsibility for paying for university education, which has been shifted onto the individual, but also is still kind of covered by the state in a clumsy fashion.
Yeah, I mean, we've ended up in a place that you really wouldn't want to have started from, and the government's in a bit of a hole in it. They didn't design it all, but they're kind of, and they really don't know what to do. I don't think it's, and basically they just want to desperately not talk about it. This is kind of really the future sustainability of HE funding is what we're really getting at, and the balance between taxpayer and individual and international student. Actually, that's the kind of other big dimension. And in this country, they just don't particularly want to talk much about it. And I don't think that is going to be a Parliament-long sustainable strategy. I think they will have to talk about it, and there will have to be some revised settlement at some point. Whether it happens in this Parliament is another matter. But I think looking to the next 5 years beyond it, there will have to be, because I don't see universities getting through. I don't think the government will be willing to preside over significant closures. I don't think in the end, but that will be tested, I think. I think there'll probably be a number of bailouts at some point over this Parliament, which will then force the conversation in a different way, because that can't be the ongoing margin of adjustment. That probably isn't going to affect places like we're sat in tonight, but it will affect lots of places which tend to have Labour MPs around the country. So this is going to be a very, very real issue when it blows.
And which tend to be attended more by lower income
by more more lower income students. So I feel like basically they're seeing if they can sort of how long they can not talk, have a sort of a major sort of approach towards thinking about the future sustainability of funding. And I feel like both actually this government and the previous government have just sort of rested for too long on, did you know there was a massive increase in tuition fees back in 2012 or whatever, and HE was relatively well funded compared to through the austerity years, which is true. That was a long time ago. That was a very long time ago, and the world has changed, and they kind of can't get to a new narrative because there's not much money around, and they don't want to be spending lots of it on this.
Yeah. We had another question here, and another at the back there. We'll take. We've got about 5 minutes, so we can take both questions and then come back to the panel.
Okay, I will keep my question short. That is, from the statistic, it seems that the inequality still widen, despite lots of people call for educational and wealth equality for a long time. So what's the obstacles for implementing these policies, try to reduce inequalities, and how should we try to overcome these obstacles?
Thank you. So overcoming obstacles, and this at the back here.
Do we have to give up on social mobility as a single generational issue and say to ourselves, actually, we can't get kids from the poorest household, middle class, livelihoods in one generation? We have to take unemployed kids from unemployed households into trades, people whose parents were tradespeople into foreman's jobs, and people whose parents were foreign to university. Take 2 or 3 generations.
So, yeah, good question. I seem to remember the chair of the Inequality Social Mobility Commission getting courting some controversy by making a similar point a couple of years ago. So the first question, what are the obstacles? And then if you want to go on to the second question as well.
So economists are the wrong people to ask this question. I had a couple of slides about what economists are good at and what we're bad at, and I didn't think I'd have time to go into the latter as long as I should. You know, we're good at measuring inequality and saying something about the cause and effect of policies, but we are completely out of our depth when it comes to the politics, you know, of redistribution. It's not a question of research. It's people who have their money want to keep it, and they will do a lot to hang on to it. And in the US, you know, we have had a concentration of wealth that has warped our politics completely, right? So we are seeing some really crazy stuff happen because Elon Musk was able to buy an election, right? So don't study economics if you want to know how to actually change the distribution of wealth. You can study it if you want to know why you should, but if you actually want to do it, go into politics or community organizing, even better.
Gavin, we'll do one question at a time.
Well, I was going to take the social mobility.
Go for it. Yeah,
I'm
absolutely.
going to try and weave a question for Sue in through it if I can. I sort of want to rail against the question, but I totally recognise why you ask it, because I kind of the idea that we give up on, you know, someone from a sort of disadvantaged background being able to become whatever because it's just too much of a stretch in one generation is just sort of shocking. But so the glib answer is no, that can't be right. The kind of more, I think it's much easier to push against that question sat in this city than it is in lots of parts of our country. I mean, I think London, London has this, like all cities, is kind of got deep poverty and lots of disadvantage. But, you know, the story of London schools and where those young people from disadvantaged backgrounds go to is a broadly impressive one, and I think would give you grounds to sort of push back against where your question was going. A lot of the country is nothing like London. I mean, London's not completely exceptional. There are other cities who have got versions, but basically a lot of the country, it is much harder, and you have to work much harder and do more, be willing to do bolder things to get to the same sort of place. And we haven't done that enough in this country. So the glib answer of course we should be able to hate for that is a bit glib. And I suppose my segue to the question I wanted to ask Sue is the thing that really, which is on the theme of social mobility, which is your question, the thing that really kind of chimed with me, which I like in your remarks, was the way you both you rail against the sort of social mobility narrative being all about, like, can we get a few more people into Harvard or something, which I think has done great damage in some ways in this country to what the notion of social mobility is, because it feels so detached from like the overwhelming majority of people in this country who just like, that's got literally nothing to do with me or my family. So they just think social mobility's got nothing.
It does matter for the reproducing the elite
for the exact reason you give. And so my question is I feel like it's really, so I've tried repeatedly to make the point that you need to have a language, you need to have a version of social mobility which resonates, which is not about, can we get, you know, more than a handful of extra people into Oxford and Cambridge or the Ivy League. But you do have to worry, for exactly the reasons you say, about the small numbers who do go to these institutions, because they are the judiciary of 20 years' time. They are the, you know, editors of our whatever new media forms they have and so on. And they are in this country. Like,
We need to actually have two thoughts in our head
and so
at
we
the
have
same
to
time.
thoughts in our
Yeah.
heads, and we're really, really bad at that on
Yeah.
this topic.
Mhm.
So kind of like, I'll wait.
It's not just access.
Yeah, it's not just
It's it's different roles. They're gatekeepers.
Yeah.
And so I do think the policy attention needs to be quite different. Probably don't need to monitor them much for quality, but maybe you would to be fair, if you're going to be monitoring the other institutions. But their main role is the reproduction of the journalistic, educational, political, name your elite, and that matters. Who's in charge matters. See our countries right now.
Neatly, it also matters for education as well, and we can see that in funding decisions, I think, for universities and further education, which, as you say, has been criminally neglected, I'd say. It's past. I think we'll close up unless anyone has any really burning questions. And there's a drinks reception where you will have a chance, hopefully, to discuss some of these issues. I certainly feel like I've got a lot to continue talking about. Thanks very much for coming, and thanks very much to Susan and Gavin. Thanks.